Michael, good morning. Good to have you with us.
Good morning, Sakina. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Michael, just taking a look at this particular matter, but perhaps a good place to start would be just to look at what is meant by unpaid pensions.
So, Sakina, put very simply, an unpaid pension benefit is any form of pension benefit, whether it's a provident fund or a pension fund, that is owed to a beneficiary. So that person either could have been the person who'd saved up towards that pension fund, or a family member, dependent, any beneficiary. So any pension benefit that's owed to one of those people and that has not yet been paid. And I think it's maybe important to state from the outset is that Open Secrets and the Unpaid Benefits Campaign, and I think others in civil society, we very deliberately call these benefits unpaid benefits, which is different to what the industry will say. So the pension fund administrators and the regulator calls them unclaimed benefits. But I think, and we can get into this in the discussion, but I think the evidence shows that many people have been trying to claim these benefits and face a system that makes it incredibly difficult to do so. And so by using the term unpaid, we try and shift that burden back to where it belongs, I think, which is with the pension funds themselves, with the administrators, and with the regulator who need to urgently trace the people that are owed these benefits.
So, Michael, what are some of the more common reasons or circumstances that would lead to these pensions not being paid out duly?
Sakina, it's a deeply historic and quite complicated problem in the main, and a lot of it dates back to the system of exploitation and abuse in South Africa's labor history, particularly as it is linked to apartheid. And so one of the really crucial elements of this is that for many decades in South Africa, employers, pension funds, and administrators didn't collect the kind of information that they would need to keep track of beneficiaries. And so what we have now is we have those fund administrators and the regulators saying it's very difficult for us to find people because records are not attached to proper ID numbers, for example, not having the correct date of birth and the full names. And that is a problem that we have to recognize. It does exist and it creates a difficulty. But I think that on top of that, there's potentially a more important issue here, which is that for very many years, there was lax record keeping and really inadequate attention paid to keeping track of assets and beneficiaries by the industry while they were profiting from administering the funds. And what we've seen is we've seen quite a lackadaisical approach over many years from first the regulator, what was then the Financial Services Board, and other actors in the industry kind of pushing that burden onto pension fund beneficiaries. And what we hear repeatedly from people trying to claim their pensions is that they are pushed from pillar to post when they're trying to search. And so if they go to the regulator might say, oh, we think you should go see Alexander Forbes. Alexander Forbes might push them somewhere else. And so people are really stuck in a system which makes it often very difficult for them to track down what might be owed to them.
And one could argue very unfairly so, but this is how it goes. But Michael, where are these monies kept? And how far does it go back? Let's say this 50 billion that we're talking about. Where is it kept? How far back does it go?
In terms of how far it goes back, in many instances, it may go back as much as 60 years. Definitely in South Africa's history, in terms of the mining sector in particular, many people who worked in the mines, and Sakina, you said at the top of the show, this is not just an issue that impacts South Africans, but many people in neighboring states, Mozambique, Lesotho, Swaziland, other places, who came here as migrant laborers, under the migrant labor system during apartheid. So that's how far back it goes in many cases. Many decades. And that's why it's also important that it's not just people who contributed to the pension fund. In many instances, they might have passed on, but it could be a family member who's then owed that benefit. In terms of where the money sits in a few different places or pools. In some cases, it remains in the original pension fund. It might be, for example, with an asset manager who has the mandate to invest those funds. But increasingly, those benefits are kept in dedicated, what the industry calls unclaimed benefits funds. And so Liberty, for example, has its own unclaimed benefit fund. Alexander Forbes has, I think, one or two unclaimed benefits funds. And so we have big pools of money there. The metals industry benefit fund, for example, also has a large portion of unclaimed benefits. And so in many cases, the money simply sits in the original fund or the asset manager waiting to be claimed. There is talk in the industry, particularly from the regulator, about wanting in the future to create a single unclaimed benefit fund. But that's where they sit. And maybe the important takeaway as well for people listening to this is that the money is still there. There's no sense that the money has disappeared. And really the challenge lies then with getting the fund administrator and the funds to trace people and link people up to the benefits that are accruing and waiting for them.
So, Michael, which industries are we talking about?
In terms of industries, it really does cover the gamut of funds. It really could be anything. And so in South Africa's history as well, before, today there are large umbrella funds that cover many employers. But going back many years, individual employers, small shops, textile factories, other factories would have had pension funds. And so in terms of the work of the Unpaid Benefits Campaign, the UBC, their members really span a range of different industries. In terms of the concentration, just given the nature, again, of South Africa's history economically, huge numbers or huge amounts of these funds are concentrated in the mining sector. And that's just given the historic patterns. But in terms of, who it covers, it really does cover everyone from domestic workers to factory workers, to mining sector workers and everyone in between. It isn't really a problem only of one sector.
So, as you indicated, if you look at the fact that this goes back 60 years, where some of these funds may date from, how does one then go about searching? As you say, maybe you had a relative, a parent or someone who may have worked in somewhere, as you say, across industries. Is there a way to go about searching so that you know whether there is, in fact, some money there that you are rightfully the recipient of? So, for example, if my father worked in the mines, where can I go to just do a cursory check, and what would I need to complete that check?
So, Sakina, this is where there is an element of good news. And that's, earlier on I said that we certainly feel that the regulator, the Financial Services Board, and then the Financial Sector Conduct Authority historically have not done enough to make this an issue and compel the tracing of beneficiaries. I think what we've seen in the last couple of years in particular is that the FSCA has become a lot more active and proactive about this problem. And the FSCA has created on its website a search engine dedicated specifically for people to try and trace unpaid benefits. So anyone, and this can be a beneficiary, as you say, if you want to search for a family member, can go to the FSCA's website, which would be fsca.co.za. And on that website, they can go to the search engine. The details you essentially would need usually would be someone's ID number, full name, date of birth, and you would plug it in there, and that would hopefully show you whether there's a record. So essentially that would then say, yes, there is something in our system. And then you would be able to take that forward with the FSCA, and they would often be able to point you towards the specific fund administrator. I would definitely urge people to use that tool. It's an important tool set up by the FSCA, and so it's important to use that. The only element of caution that I would say is that by the FSCA's own admission, their own data remains a bit of a problem. And so if you do not find a record that pops up in that search engine, it doesn't necessarily mean unambiguously that there is not a benefit owing to you. There may be a problem with the data. And in that instance, and in particular, if you are having difficulty with a fund administrator that is kind of not being responsive, I would then urge people to contact the Unpaid Benefits Campaign, which is a civil society organization, a coalition based largely around Gauteng, but in other places as well. And they are organizing on a community level for people who are trying to trace benefits. And I would really urge people who are having these kinds of difficulties also to get in touch with them. And so that really is the two-stage process. It's the FSCA's website, I think, is a starting point, but also to remember that the Unpaid Benefits Campaign is doing remarkable work in this regard as well.
So as you were speaking, I'm actually on that site now. I've opened it, and it says unclaimed benefits search, and then it asks you, these inquiry is on behalf of myself, or the surname of the person on whose behalf you're inquiring. And if you need consent, if it's not for yourself, that would need to be put in there, and so on and so forth. So it is actually up there on their website. I'm going to search through that just for myself, just to see how that process works out as we move on. But then just moving along in this particular conversation, as you said, Michael, the funds are basically absolving themselves. But the point here is that there are many people, as you said, not just in South Africa, but in Southern Africa, whose monies are lying here, and they may actually have great need for this money. So rightfully, though, should government not be doing more to ensure that, they perhaps come up with some sort of legislation that would assist in this process to try and trace these beneficiaries?
Absolutely, Sakina. I think that Open Secrets and UBC in particular thinks that there needs to be much more concerted, proactive, and I think coordinated action by government in collaboration with the private fund administrators to address this problem. You raise an important issue there, which is something we haven't touched on in great detail, which is that for so many millions of people, this would be absolutely vital access to resources during what has been for many years now a very difficult period. And we must also be frank here that for many people who are owed their unpaid benefits, it may not necessarily be a huge pension fund. But I think for those nearly 5 million people, whatever they are owed, I think at this time would be such a vital contribution. And I think apart from the fact that obviously legally they are obliged to the benefits that have been deducted from their salaries over many years, the kind of social impact, I think, of having this access and opening these funds to those who are owed would be so powerful and important. I think what we would want to see in particular is much more effort from Parliament to try and compel action in this regard. And so we've seen the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, as I've said, doing a little bit more, creating the search engine and being a bit more proactive in this regard. And yet pension fund administrators have been very inconsistent with how active they've been. We've seen, for example, slightly more activity from Liberty over the last few years and slightly less from an actor like Alex Forbes. And so we'd want to see more from them. And I think we'd want to see from the Standing Committee on Finance in Parliament to convene hearings on the matter, bring together all actors who are involved and say, urgently, we need a plan that I think we will monitor and provide oversight to as Parliament, to have a plan to trace these beneficiaries. And I think just a final word on that would be, it's very important for there to be kind of cross-sector collaboration here. And so it's not just a matter of a single pension fund, for example, but the pension fund, all of their data, together with data that might be held with TEBA in the mining sector, the Department of Health, for example, regarding claims around compensation. And what the industry, I think, increasingly is seeing is that it takes that level of coordination and information sharing to really properly do tracing efforts. And we have examples that show it is possible to find people. Just because it's difficult does not make it impossible. I think the experience with tracing people who are owed settlements out of the class action silicosis case, for example, people scattered around the country, is a great example of what can be done when a group of people put their minds towards tracing people. And I think, that's really what we want to see. And we want to see a little bit more urgency and action because the problem is growing. The unpaid benefits over years, kind of that amount keeps going up. And so, concerted action and urgent action, I think, from Parliament and from the Financial Sector Conduct Authority.
Absolutely. But of course, where there's money involved, there's usually also a lot of crooks involved. And I could just imagine people watching this now, and next best thing, there's someone knocking on your door saying that, you may have some unclaimed benefits, so we can help you access that money, and who knows what happens after that. I'm not sure, if this is commonplace at the moment, Michael, but what sort of advice can you give to people in that regard? And also, just finally, how long will these monies be kept? Is there a possibility that at some point the law would indicate that something needs to be done, or it gets absolved somewhere into another fund? How does it all work?
So, Sakina, on the first question, it's really important, I think, that what you've raised is that there's a huge susceptibility to abuse of this system. And what I think the Unpaid Benefits Campaign, for example, has found is that there are many charlatans out there looking to take advantage of the system. And so I think it would be the same advice that we would provide to anyone generally regarding anyone who approaches you with promises regarding helping you financially, just to be very cautious about anyone who contacts you, particularly out of the blue. And in particular, anyone who asks you for money in order to trace a benefit. So if a tracing agent contacts you, for example, from a pension fund or a pension fund administrator, what would usually happen is that person would get a portion of funds, but it would come from the fund administrator. It would not be a requirement for you to make that payment. And so I think anyone requesting that, everyone should treat with a lot of caution. I think linked to that is just to go back to what I said earlier, is to remember as much as possible to engage the FSCA directly, or to go through organizations who are reputable and who are working in the space. And in that case, again, the Unpaid Benefits Campaign doing remarkable work in this regard. And the Unpaid Benefits Campaign are also doing work to identify those people who are trying to scam people and abuse the system, and then reporting them to the FSCA for action. So that's regarding the first question. On your second question, at the moment, the current status is that money will remain there in perpetuity. And the industry is obviously very clear, is that legally it's important that anyone who's owed a benefit, that benefit is preserved until them or one of their dependents claim it. So for the moment, that money is there. It may be that the state moves towards a single unclaimed benefit fund where all those unpaid benefits are kept pending tracing. I think if that does happen, we have to be very cautious about the oversight and the governance of a fund like that, because what we have seen is we've seen politicians and other opportunistic people starting to look at the unpaid benefits pot as something to access money for times of crisis during COVID or to bail out Eskom. And it's really important, I think, kind of across the country, that we push back and say those benefits are owed to the people who worked for decades, very often had portions of their salary deducted precisely to access a retirement pension to assist them and families in old age. Just because there's not enough has been done to identify those people doesn't now make that pot of money open for redistribution for other purposes or political means. It's vital that it's kept, it's preserved. Yes, it should be invested shrewdly so that there's also a return, and that can fund the work of tracing in the fund in other ways. But it's very important that we don't open that up, I think, because then we're going to have everyone with a political agenda wanting to access a billion here and a billion there. And I think that then would become a big risk.
I think, Michael, we'll leave it there for today, but hopefully we'll have opportunity to catch up again just to see how things are going post this conversation.